when you're making cultural policy whose goal it is to increase the cultural realm, that the way that you increase the health of the cultural realm is to allow more people to participate in it in more ways. And so we can imagine a copyright system. In fact, we have a copyright system apparently that either allows 5 Hollywood studios to make about 40 hours of film a year, or allows hundreds of millions of people to make 29 hours of video per minute, which is YouTube. Now the studios have said that YouTube, because it can't police that 29 hours a minute and stop some of the studios' very narrow slice of product from showing up on YouTube, that YouTube should just basically stop existing. That we should put it out of its misery, because it shouldn't be there at all if they can't protect the copyrights of the studios. But when you frame this as, do we want 30 hours of video from 5 sources, or 30 hours of video a minute from hundreds of millions of sources, it seems like that's kind of a no-brainer, right? If we want to promote culture, which is to say all the things that we do among ourselves that make us who we are, then we should really promote this one over here, the 30 hours a minute. And I kind of believe that probably these two could coexist. I think the studios can probably figure out how to make movies that can thrive even when they're being shared, and if they can't, someone will come along who'll figure out how to do that. I mean, there's plenty of video being produced on YouTube that thrives when it shares, even video being produced by commercial entities. Even if we lose the summer blockbuster, so be it. I mean, I'll trade summer blockbusters for 30 hours of video a minute. I mean, I do like sitting in a cave with 1,000 other people watching Bruce Willis beat up a jet with his bare hands, but not so much that I would kill every other piece of amateur video on the internet. The copyright wars aren't new, of course. I say every pirate wants to be an admiral, right? So, in the first part of the 20th century, you had sheet music composers, Tim Panally, who represented the only real music industry, right? They were an industry as opposed to like a trade, because they had an industrial apparatus, a copying machine that made sheet music, and so they could sell it. They could sell it even when they weren't there. And you had performers who weren't really an industry, they were just a trade, because you could only make money as a performer if you were actually performing, and there was no industrial component. And then someone invented recorded music. And the performers who'd been buying their sheet music down at Tin Pan Alley and recording and performing it all these years started to perform it into recording devices. And the composer said, "What are you doing? You're selling our compositions without our permission. You must stop this. It's an act of piracy." And the performers said, with somewhat understandably, "You sold us the sheet music. Didn't you think we'd perform it?" Different states came up with different answers. But at the end of the day, all the countries that made a successful transition to having a recorded music industry eventually said, composers actually don't get a say in whether or not their music is recorded. They may get some money from a kind of automatic royalty system, but you don't get to say, okay, this can only be performed here, only that guy can perform it. Once it's been performed once, everyone can perform it and everyone can record it, because that's how music is. So here you have the great pirates of the first decade of the 20th century, the music performers, the record labels. And the record labels turned around not that long afterwards and pointed at the radio stations and said, "What are you doing playing our records on the radio? You have no business doing it. That what we did when we took those compositions without permission, that was progress. What you jerks are doing, that's just piracy." And of course the broadcasters went out and they said, no, you should let us broadcast. And they eventually won that fight, and they were the brave pirates who'd become the mainstream. And so when cable operators started taking broadcast signals and pumping them out over cable wires, the broadcasters said, well, when we took that music from the record labels, that was progress. But when you take our radio diffusion and pump it down over a cable, that's just piracy. And the cable operators fought that fight. And along came the VCR, which could record programs off the cable. And the cable operators, having won the fight with the broadcasters, went along and said, when we took those broadcasts, that was progress. When you take our cable transmissions and record them on a VHS cassette, well, that's piracy. And then the company that invented the VCR, Sony, joined with the major studios in suing the internet for taking movies that had been diffused on DVD or on VHS cassette or over the air and putting them on the internet. And they said, when we took your broadcasts and put them on a cable, or when we took your cable diffusion and put it on a VHS cassette, that was progress. But when you take it and put it on the internet, that's just piracy. And the biggest difference now, I think, is the extent to which they're being taken seriously. I think it used to be true that no lawmaker believed that he could be reelected by breaking the thing that his constituents use to entertain themselves. And now there seems to be an awful willingness to, I don't know, go to Corfu with a music producer and come back and propose that the internet should be censored and that people who are accused of file sharing should be locked out of it and so on. And I guess that's the major difference and the thing that gives me real anxiety about the future of the internet.